When I have breakfast in the morning after I wake up and get out of bed, it's usually very brief. I allocate just enough time to consume a small meal and drink some coffee while my mind gradually becomes more alert. From where I sit at the kitchen table, there's a direct sight line to the family room TV. While having breakfast, I'll watch the local news to get a sense of what's going on in my geographical area and just beyond that. Although there are some positive stories, the vast majority possess a more negative or grim tone. For example, the news recently reported that there was yet another shooting in a somewhat far but still relatively nearby community. Meanwhile, there was also an attempted murder in a public park that's much closer to home, just a community over, in fact. I'd rather commence the day on a positive note, but it's evidently arduous to do so when I hear of such events so close to home. Realizing the detrimental effects of persistently focusing on adverse events and consuming media which frequently highlights them, this begs a particular question. Should you endeavor to completely ignore the world around you? The evident rationale for this decision would be to not only preserve your sanity, but also to avoid experiencing unnecessary distresses and anxieties that will detract from present satisfaction. Today's discussion attempts to examine this question and the natural implications which stem from it. It will be asserted that although there are circumstances and situations you should essentially ignore for the sake of your sanity and well-being, it's also highly inadvisable to completely ignore the external world, both in terms of your immediate vicinity and further beyond. Comparable to what's often remarked about politics, you might be able to ignore the outside world, but it won't necessarily ignore you. What you should aspire to do then is be selective or strategic in where you fixate your attention and also what you choose to ignore. Utilizing rational discernment will be vital in determining which matters should be disregarded versus those which demand your full attention. To begin, why is it so appealing to close your mind and disregard the world around you? Simply put, it's because closing our minds is perceived as the easy route to prevent further suffering and hardship. Additionally, there's no shortage of people and organizations that are constantly vying for your effort, attention, time, money, or all four. Regarding the first reason, it's understandable why we desire to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. Pain is generally denoted as harmful or distressing, whereas pleasure is generally denoted as positive or pleasant. Unless you're a masochist, nobody actively enjoys pain and says to themselves, "I'm looking forward to experiencing pain today," especially the types I desperately wish to avoid along with those that I wish would simply disappear. In my case, I certainly wish that the chronic physical discomfort I've been experiencing for a while now would disappear. When the pain is intense, it's extremely easy to close my mind and ignore the outside world because all I can focus on is trying to mitigate the discomfort. Utilizing escapism as a method to ignore problems comes naturally, but what demands considerable effort is to actively confront distressing circumstances. It's painful and distressing to confront the unknown, to willingly challenge the world with all of its horrors. Part of this action is opening up your mind to the terrifying truths that accompany the unknown. Once your eyes have been opened and you've been made aware of something, you cannot return to the prior state of being before you acquired such knowledge. Increased knowledge often means increased sorrow, and it makes sense why remaining closed off or ignorant to particular knowledge is preferable for many. Remaining ignorant of distressing knowledge and harsh truths gives you a shield or cop-out to protect you from harm, at least in the short term. This method works until the truth becomes so obvious that it can no longer be ignored, when the rug is swept out from underneath your feet. This phenomenon is akin to standing on the edge of a coastal cliff that's gradually being eroded by the waves. It might be fine for now, but eventually the ground will collapse right where you're standing. Instead of heeding the warnings, you're so enraptured by the picturesque horizon that you ignore the impending danger. Digressing, the second aforementioned reason as to why it's easy to disregard the world around us evidently involves the news media and its robust influence. Most, if not all of the stories they publish are imbued with carefully constructed narratives designed to distract, mislead, or incite particular actions and emotions from viewers. This is especially true with subjective opinion pieces masquerading as factual or objective interpretations of phenomena and events. On TV, it's called a program for a reason, because it's programming or conditioning you to think and behave in a particular manner. An often misattributed quote to Mark Twain remarks, quote, "If I read the newspaper, then I'm misinformed, and if I don't read the newspaper, then I'm uninformed." End quote. Although there's little to no evidence he actually made this remark, one cannot deny its truth and relevancy. Indeed, I can persistently consume news media, but then I'm not actually informed about anything. Rather, I've become indoctrinated to believe false narratives and distortions that contain only a sliver of truth at best. But if I make no attempt to follow current affairs, then I run the risk of being totally ignorant to what's occurring in the world around me. Quite the dilemma, but I know that I'd rather start from scratch. I'd rather wade through shallow waters before I challenge deeper waters with rougher waves. And so, I tend to watch the news exclusively for local matters, and even then it's for a brief period of time, just to glean enough information about circumstances that may have a direct or indirect impact on myself or my family. If there's a topic I wish to acquire more information about, then I'll embark on further independent research to verify what I had initially seen or heard. With many legacy news media stories containing falsehoods and straight-up BS, it's wise to consciously ignore them. You'll save yourself from becoming unnecessarily riled up in addition to preserving a few brain cells from not having to read utter garbage. It's essentially for these reasons why I don't retain any social or news media apps on my phone, save for YouTube. Aimlessly scrolling through posts is a massive time and energy waster, so minimizing sources where this can occur is imperative. To summarize this section, it's understandable why we can easily shun or ignore the world around us because there's no shortage of distressing events and situations we'd rather avoid, in addition to mediums that remind us of life's tragedies. One option to combat overwhelming despair could be avoiding the news entirely, which actually seems like a wise thing to do these days since much of it is propaganda. Meanwhile, another option could be avoiding other people, endeavors, and situations that evoke distress. Although this option is appealing, it's not beneficial in the long term. Problems don't go away if you ignore them. Instead, they become exacerbated through continued inaction. Building off these remarks, the concluding section will explain why it's contrary to your best interests to completely ignore the world around you. Ultimately, you should endeavor to focus on circumstances that actually matter and effectively using your discernment to understand what you should ignore. As mentioned earlier, you can choose to ignore the world, but the world won't necessarily ignore you. An apt example of this fact occurs when you're driving. You can willingly ignore traffic rules and customs along with all the other drivers, but this will inevitably lead to disaster. If you decide to continue driving through an intersection where your side is displaying a red light, then don't be surprised when you get T-boned or in a severe accident. This driving metaphor translates well into other life areas, such as work, relationships, and the like. Interpersonal relationships frequently collapse due to neglect and obliviousness, something which largely stems from a lack of effort or willingness to pay attention. The remedy is being acutely aware of what's happening with the people you care about, not only so you can render assistance to maintain the relationship, but also to ensure you aren't caught off guard when threatening circumstances arise. For work, completely ignoring other people or your responsibilities isn't going to help in the long term. Perhaps in the short term, the avoidance and procrastination will save you some discomfort, but it'll eventually lead to a greater magnitude of hardship. Once again, the remedy is being attentive to what your colleagues are doing and what tasks must be completed. Actively choosing to confront difficult challenges and not shying away from them is necessary, and it will continue to be necessary. You won't be able to progress otherwise, nor will you be able to maintain your current status without doing this. In every area of life, this principle is vital, as your discernment will enable you to decide what you should ignore and what you should focus on, or what's worthy of attention and effort. This may appear as an ignorance is bliss attitude, but there's nothing wrong with possessing it at least some of the time. We cannot focus on every negative circumstance in the world at every single moment in time. It would be far too overwhelming, and therefore, selectively focusing your attention mitigates this risk. Confronting challenges and distressing situations can only be effectively performed when you narrow your focus. You won't be stretched too thin, and you'll perform meaningful work that truly benefits others. Political and social causes readily comes to mind. With so much injustice and evil in the world, you're better suited to pick a few causes that you actually give a damn about and working on fixing them, compared to pretending that you care about every problem under the sun. This latter option of virtue signaling, which is frequently witnessed on social media these days, doesn't do anyone any good, especially not for the people you are supposedly helping and not for your own character as well. Don't completely ignore the world around you, but rather, selectively focus and be strategic about where you allocate your concentration. This way you can maintain your sanity, satisfaction, and perform meaningful actions that truly benefit others no matter where you go and what you do. Thank you for taking the time to watch. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing.